It is no secret that South Africans feel battered by stories of corruption, organized crime, greed, and that powerful people continue to be implicated. It might be surprising then that in other parts of the world, South Africa is celebrated for its efforts. In this series of conversations, we focus on the other side. We want to move beyond headlines and hear from people at the coalface of efforts to deal with corruption and organized crime. I'm Cheryl Frank. I run the Anti-Corruption and Accountability Project at the Institute for Security Studies. Pranesh Maharaj is the Chief Program Portfolio Officer at the Special Investigating Unit. Following our research about the SIU's successes and challenges, a link to that is in the show notes here, we wanted to understand the emergence of the SIU's prevention role and how that might feature in the future in terms of anti-corruption efforts in South Africa. This is particularly in the context of the recommendations made by the President's National Anti-Corruption Advisory Council. And we have provided a link to their report to the President from August 2025 in the show notes as well. Pranesh has been leading the SIU's data analytics and prevention work. This aspect of the SIU's work has evolved out of their investigation mandate and promises to serve as a key lever towards proactive anti-corruption prevention in the country. So welcome everybody. We're in our continuing conversation with the Special Investigating Unit, and we're talking to Pranesh Maharaj today. Pranesh, you're the Chief Program Portfolio Officer at the SIU. Give us a view into the structure of the SIU and how the institution is set up to meet its programmatic objectives, and then, of course, where you fit in.
Sure. Thanks very much, Cheryl. So the SIU is established primarily as a forensic investigation and a civil litigation recovery agency. Our core business comprises forensic investigators, lawyers, accountants, cyber forensic specialists, forensic data analysts, etc. That is the team that performs our investigations. Then we have our enablement functions such as HR, IT, risk communications, etc. Where I come in is when we reviewed our operating model and our value chain a few years ago, we recognized that as a country, there's a lacuna in terms of nothing being done when it comes to prevention. So we are very good at always being reactive, going in after a problem has occurred, but not enough was being done from a point of view of preventing maladministration before it actually occurred. And when we benchmarked, especially with Hong Kong, the Independent Commission Against Corruption, we found that a lot of emphasis was being placed on prevention. It just so happened that around the same time the National Anti-Corruption Strategy was being developed, and the strategy also placed a lot of emphasis on prevention. So it was at that stage during our organizational redesign that we established the Market Data Analytics and Prevention Unit, which I am responsible for. And our role primarily is, as the name suggests, is to focus on prevention, but at the same time we do also then complement the existing investigations that are ongoing.
So maybe just explain then how those two pieces connect to each other. You've got that investigative piece, very complex, lots of very complex functions going on there. But then how does your function, particularly data analytics, and how that features against that?
So it's a two-pronged approach, essentially. One being very proactive and the other being more reactive in a sense. And I'll explain that. So from a proactive point of view, when an investigation kicks off, typically investigators would collect data that is relevant to that investigation. The market data analytics team, which I'm responsible for, we would then mine the data to identify any red flags or anomalies. We then pass that information over to investigations because it allows then for a more targeted, focused investigation. If you know that there are these red flags that the data is showing, you can then focus your investigation and pursue those outcomes, which then means that you have a chance to go after the so-called low-hanging fruit, and you can make an immediate outcome. So that's the proactive assistance that's rendered to investigations, essentially leveraging technology for better investigation outcomes. Then there's the part where an investigation runs its course, it's finalized, and we are then given the investigation data. So we then, as the market data analytics unit, we mine that data, and what we are looking for is insights or trends or observations that we can see from the data. So the data is typically going to tell us, what happened, why it happened, and that will then inform our prevention team, where they are then able to structure targeted awareness campaigns to be able to put in place a prevention plan with the affected state institution. So they can take the insight and say, this is where your problems typically are. These are the risks that we've identified from the investigation. We can now assist you with what we call a systemic improvement plan that we will develop, and we will then assist the state institution to implement, and we will then monitor the implementation of it. So, it's effectively, it's a two-pronged approach to prevention.
And so what are your team of people, what are these skills that you're employing in the context of trying to achieve both of those objectives?
So in the market data analytics team, we have data analysts. We have we also have an intern who's recently joined us as well, who's also studying data analytics as well. It's a very small team at the moment, but it is growing. But typically, because it's a very niche kind of a skill, it's not easy to attract that sort of talent, especially from the private sector. The talent that we have been able to attract thus far, I think we've been very fortunate. And our selling point was to be able to say, yes, we understand, you're in the private sector, you're making a lot of money, it's all good and well, but how about coming over and doing your civic duty to the country as a nation? And I think that, that's a line that I'm going to continually punt and tell people, join us, because you can actually contribute to being part of the solution where you actually can make a difference. Then with my prevention team, the typical skill set that we have is are people who are well versed in ethics awareness, anti-corruption initiatives, education to a certain extent as well, because there is an element of education that's involved.
So I think just going back to this data analytics that you do, even if it's driven to some extent in support of investigations, but then looking for patterns and observations that you can communicate back to institutions, it must give you a unique view into the corruption trends.
Absolutely.
So maybe you can give us some highlights of what you're seeing in the context of the SIU has been involved in. I don't know the number of investigations, 100 to date.
Correct.
So how far back does your data analytics sort of framework go? And then what are the trends you can tell us about that you're seeing now?
So our data analytics goes back as far as the very early days of the SIU, when we were doing what we called process investigations. We were investigating the award of driver's licenses and social grants. So there was quite a big data set that we looked at. So that's one area I'm going to speak about what we're seeing. And then later our investigations then evolved, and we became more heavily involved in procurement investigations. And that's been the bulk of our work over I would say the last 15 to 20 years. When we look at where we started with the so-called process investigations, we identified instances where systems were being compromised. So you would have unscrupulous officials who would look for gaps in the systems, and they would then exploit those gaps for personal gains. And here I'm talking about things like the awarding of driver's licenses, applications being made for social grants as well. Essentially what it meant was there was widespread endemic, I like to call it a systemic abuse of process. So that's the one pattern that we observed, systemic corruption. As we moved into the procurement space, we then found that the data was telling us that there were instances of things like collusive bidding, fronting, supply chain management officials being corrupted by bidders, a more sophisticated form of corruption that we were able to pick up. And so that is almost tantamount to the grand corruption that we are seeing. A lot of it was mentioned by the State Capture Commission as well. So essentially, those are the two typologies that we are seeing: the systemic corruption on the one hand, and the grand corruption on the other. And you may recall from the recommendations that have been made by the National Anti-Corruption Advisory Council that there is a definite need for the systemic corruption to be investigated, to be rooted out. And we're saying, yes, we agree with that because of what we have seen. And it didn't stop with the driver's licenses or with the social grants, because a few years ago, we obtained a proclamation to investigate the National Student Financial Aid Scheme. And even when it comes to student funding as well, we are seeing the same typologies. With the lottery investigation as well, we are seeing the same thing. Where systems are being abused, they're being manipulated for personal gain.
And a little bit about, maybe a little bit more insight into the patterns and what sorts of crime trends are you seeing, or systemic failures maybe, failures in the system to pick up patterns of the problem, and then how that leads to, I know, investigative recommendations obviously, but then how that leads to some of what you do in prevention. Yeah.
The systemic failures that we are seeing actually come about through a circumvention of processes. For example, where there ought to be segregation of duties, there are no segregation of duties, or control systems that are put in place are simply bypassed, which then allows one individual to be able to look at an order, approve the payment, do everything, bypassing the normal checks and balances that should be in the process. Interestingly, when we investigated in 2023 the procurement of personal protective equipment during COVID, the types of things that we saw then was how overnight businesses evolved, where you would get a business that for years was involved in panel beating, for example. Overnight they became a supplier of PPE.
Yes.
And it was opportunism, at its worst. And unfortunately, what these, some may call it entrepreneurial skills, but what these unscrupulous actors eventually did was they saw the gap, they took the gap, but then they hiked their prices to the extent where in a time of crisis, in the time of a pandemic, they were able to enrich themselves while people were losing their lives, which was really unconscionable. And so we then found that these same actors who became active all of a sudden during COVID-19 and supplying PPE, after the pandemic was over, they then moved on to public works and infrastructure. And then the panel beater then moved from supplying PPE to all of a sudden becoming construction, because they had already established their links with officials in positions of influence, and they were then able to tailor or adapt their businesses accordingly. So what you're finding is that the same players seem to come up, albeit in different sectors, but essentially the modus operandi remains the same.
Okay, so let's go back then to your recommendations that you would make to an institution to fix its systems, to address some of the weaknesses in the system. You'd come up with a plan.
Yes.
So tell us how that works. So you obviously it's evidence-based plan that comes from real issues you've investigated and real problems you've noted. So you take that plan back to the management of that department. How does it, tell us about that process?
Okay. At the end of the investigation, those recommendations are then consolidated,
Right.
and we then approach the affected state institution. We offered to take them through our investigation and what we found, but more importantly, we offered to take them through the systemic recommendations that were made. We then conduct what we call a targeted awareness campaign at that institution. So what we do is we offer to host this awareness campaign with senior officials of the state institution, and we then leave it up to them to decide who is best placed to be at this campaign, because they must ultimately benefit from it. When we have our audience in place, we take them through the investigation, but importantly, we also inculcate a multidisciplinary approach. So in that campaign from the SIU side, our team is made up of our prevention colleagues, colleagues from data analytics. We also include internal audit, risk, legal as well, and our internal integrity unit. And we present an overall anti-corruption program to the state institution. We then have breakaway sessions, and in those breakaway sessions, what we do is we then isolate the specific systemic recommendations that we've made. We take them to each breakaway, and we then say, this is the problem. You, as employees of the state institution, you tell us how you think, what would be the best way to solve this problem, come up with a plan. So each group would then tackle an individual systemic recommendation. At the end, we consolidate it. We consolidate it into what we call a systemic improvement plan. And we then assist the state institution not only to implement that plan, but we also then monitor the implementation of the plan. So on a quarterly basis, we would follow up and say, where are you in terms of progress? Are there any challenges? If there are challenges, let's see how we can assist you. And over time, the idea is that if we fix the systems, we're not going to find ourselves as the SIU going back in 10 years' time and reinvestigating the same things. So essentially, the whole prevention aspect that we are now offering, it's meant to inculcate or it's meant to bring about a change in mindset where we're not always going to be reactive and going after something has gone wrong. We want to start putting measures in place now already to prevent us from having to investigate in the future.
So once you present that plan to the managers and staff and help them understand it, develop their own plans about mitigation, what measures can you put in place to ensure that they do implement the recommendations? So is this a bit of a difficult point then?
It's not a difficult point. I think that the answer lies in the way the SIU Act is currently structured.
Right.
And why I mention that is because as a creature of statute established in terms of an act, the SIU has specific functions. Prevention is not specifically listed as a function. So if we are to present a plan and if nothing is done to implement, we unfortunately do not have the powers to be able to compel implementation. It's something that we recognize, and we have proposed substantial amendments to the Department of Justice for the Act. But that's not to say that all is lost, because there are other ways. When we come across reluctance from state institutions to do that, then there are other means that at our disposal that we can use to prompt people to act. One of the ways to do it is that the SIU has established a number of sector-specific anti-corruption fora, and these fora were established pursuant to risk analysis being done about which sectors may be particularly vulnerable to corruption. And we then use the different anti-corruption, sector-specific anti-corruption fora as a way to table these plans and to be able to then get buy-in, especially from the private sector and civil society, because they also form part of these anti-corruption fora, to be able to then mobilize civil society to put the necessary pressure on to be able to say, well, here's a plan, it's been presented, what have you done about it? And it works relatively well. And I think it also speaks to, what the National Anti-Corruption Strategy talks about when it says whole of society, whole of government approach. And that's what we try to do as well. So where there may be limitations in terms of the SIU not being able to compel or to enforce, there are other means at our disposal to be able to trigger the necessary consequence management. Having said that, I'm also happy to say that we've been inundated with requests from state institutions for assistance, to the extent that at times we can't keep up with the amount of awareness campaigns that we have to conduct. So if there are those that are reluctant, those are very, very few and far between.
Okay. So the SIU Act makes limited provision for prevention.
Yes.
So if you were to look at how to make the SIU fit for purpose for our current circumstances, how would we look at reviewing the legislation? What would we be doing and prioritizing in that context?
So firstly, prevention has to be included as a specific function in the Act in Section 4 for the SIU. The prevention provision should allow for the SIU to be able to provide prevention, awareness, and advisory services to state institutions, to be able to train state officials or public servants in prevention work. But then also, and this is from the data analytics point of view, if the SIU establishes instances of possible risks, then the SIU should be able to go in proactively and implement a risk mitigation strategy at the affected state institution by developing a system or a policy or a framework. Currently, that is absent in the Act, which then means that our hands are tied to a certain extent. Okay. But those are the kinds of amendments that we would need, especially from a prevention point of view. There are other issues such as the funding model, which needs to be changed as well, but I'm sure Eddie would have touched on that already.
Yes. So I want to go back a little bit on your prevention forums.
Yes.
And speak about how those came to be, and then what do you do in terms of, I understand you have one on health, for example. Yes. So how do you look at those sectors and identify risks, and then what do those plans look like? How do you support the implementation? Can you just take us through that?
The point is the SIU is the convener of Program 4 of the former Anti-Corruption Task Team, now known as the National Priority Crimes Coordinating Committee. As the convener of Program 4, the SIU was tasked to conduct a risk assessment on sectors that are particularly vulnerable to corruption. We then use investigation data as well as open source data, Auditor General reports, etc., to come up with a list of vulnerable sectors. I think there are 16 in total, if memory serves. Based on the 16, we then prioritized health as the first anti-corruption forum to launch. We adopted, in establishing the forum, we adopted a very inclusive approach. And the idea was that we wanted to get the public and the private sector together, sit around the same table, and then address issues that may be relevant to a particular sector. And the reason for this inclusive approach, or collective action, as we'd like to call it, was that there was an acknowledgement that corruption can't just be government's problem. It's everyone's problem. And so we should all work together. In saying that, we then extended an invite to civil society, faith-based organizations, NGOs, academia, labor, etc. And then in combination with national, provincial, and local government, we formed the Health Sector Anti-Corruption Forum. The forum is regulated by terms of reference. It spells out the rights of the parties that are members of the forum, but it doesn't create any obligations in the sense that there are any contractual obligations that are created. Essentially, the terms of reference are a guide as to how the parties should work together to address sector-specific issues. The Anti-Corruption Forum for Health, this model is has been replicated with local government, border management and immigration, infrastructure build, and recently water and sanitation. The real nuts and bolts of the workings of the Anti-Corruption Forum it resides with the steering committee. So you have your broader forum with the principals, who are typically the heads of the different entities that are sitting together. And those heads then nominate individuals to then form part of the steering committee. The steering committee's job is to receive allegations relating to that sector. The steering committee will then assess those allegations and decide who amongst the parties in the forum is best placed to deal with allegations based on their mandate. And you would then find that after the steering committee assesses a matter, it may refer it to, for example, the Auditor General and say, here's a matter we believe it's best suited to you to look into. Please investigate and then come back and tell us what was done. So there is this loop in terms of monitoring the referrals. When the steering committee then assesses what's been done and the progress that's been made, it then reports back to the principals on a quarterly basis. The model has worked very, very well. The health sector, the local government sector as well, they are operating very, very well in terms of allegations being reported, being assessed, and there are concrete outcomes that we've actually reported on publicly as well. And we believe that the idea of then having the whole of society working together in this way, collective action, that's the way that we are going to be able to be successful if we are going to then prevent and combat corruption as we move into the future.
So the stakeholders that participate in the forum, civil society,
Yes.
private sector, etc., they themselves have corruption risks associated within their frameworks. I mean, private sector actors are the ones that can be proactively engaging in corrupt activities. So how are you sort of tackling that sort of cultural dimension, values dimension in the context of those forums?
Initially, the public sector, when they came on board, they were happy to sit as interested observers, and it was good to have their support. With the amendment to Section 34 of the Prevention and Combating of Corrupt Activities Act, which now imposes an injunction on private companies and SOEs to now actually have a prevention plan in place to prevent corruption, because if you don't, you could then be guilty of an offense.
Yeah.
We've now found that we've now had approaches from the private sector to be able to say, can you come in, can you assist us? Can we put a plan in place so that we have a guiding framework? What is nice is that, as I mentioned before, there is now this real acknowledgement that corruption just isn't government's problem, that everyone has to work together in order to tackle it. And because of that, we've now forged good working relationships with entities in the private sector to be able to work together to put prevention plans in place, but also importantly to be able to learn from the private sector as we seek to roll out a prevention plan for government. Because as the SIU, we are in the process of developing a national corruption prevention and risk management framework for the country. The idea being that we want to have a uniform set of guidelines for the country to be able to adopt and implement when it comes to risk management and corruption prevention. So we can learn from each other, but at the same time, it's good that the private sector has actually now called on government for assistance, when looking at their risk mitigation and corruption prevention initiatives.
Am I correct that in the private sector we have frameworks like King 4, King 5, and which relates to corporate governance and so on? To me, there's a sense that we don't have closer to the bone anti-corruption prevention frameworks and support, which explains then the demand in response to PRECA, the PRECA amendment.
Yes, correct. That's one part of it, and then the other part of it is actually what informed the development of the National Corruption Prevention and Risk Management Framework, is to be able to have a uniform set of guidelines that talk specifically to anti-corruption initiatives, which would include risk management.
Very interesting. So there having to be shifts all across the system in order to make this work.
Yes.
And you're supporting shifts in the private sector and the public sector.
Absolutely. And where we are with the framework is that currently it's in its 5th draft, and we are about to embark now on a process of public consultations, extensive stakeholder consultations, to now be able to take inputs from the whole of society, but more especially targeting private sector businesses, so that they must be made to feel that they are part of the process. So you don't want to, at the end of the day, just roll out a framework and say, here, implement it. You want to be able to feel that you contributed to it, and so it becomes a document that you actually live with and you walk with.
So yes, a substantial amount of work then required in the context of these sector-specific work. Do you have the capabilities, the capacity to do it? Let me just say that. Do you have the people? Do you have the resources? And I understand the SIU has some work to do in terms of the funding model. What is the means of expanding? Do we have the foundation for that in the SIU's funding model?
Resources are always an issue for us. Capacity issues, including tools of trade, continues to be a problem. What we are doing in the short term is we are going for a more scalable kind of a model where, depending on the number of proclamations that we have at any given point in time, we may then hire skills on a contract basis. Essentially have a scalable model. Bring people in specifically for a certain investigation. Once the investigation is done, you then release them and you go forward like that. Because my view personally is that you can't just keep throwing money at a problem by continuing to bring in more and more resources. What you need is a culture change, a mindset change. We are not, as a country, going to be able to investigate ourselves out of a corruption crisis. That's not the answer. The answer is to move more towards proactive prevention as opposed to reactive investigations. Having said that, investigations are necessary. They will still continue. But the idea is to change mindsets to move towards a preventative type of a culture that will then complement or supplement your existing reactive investigations. So I mean, the SIU is in a war of talent, along with our competitors, especially in law enforcement, with the National Prosecuting Authority, the Investigative Directorate as well. And the last thing you want is to decapacitate a system that's already working, because everyone has a specific role to play in this. So the answer would possibly be look at more of a rationalization or a streamlining of existing capabilities, and then determining how best do you use your resources. And ultimately, you should be able to make maximum impact in the minimum amount of time based on the available resources at any given point in time.
I see that the SIU also fosters relationships with its international counterparts, very proactive about those relationships. How does that support your prevention agenda?
Primarily, our work is governed by the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. But we also take a lot of learnings from the Hong Kong model. The SIU has taken made quite a few trips to Hong Kong to learn from the Independent Commission Against Corruption. And we've also attended a number of other training initiatives, conferences, etc., just to not only to benchmark, but to also gather insights and learnings. In a number of instances, we've concluded memoranda of understanding with our counterparts, and those MOUs speak to then things like data sharing, skills transfer, and training as well. The fact that the SIU is now co-chairing the G20 Anti-Corruption Working Group also presents us with a very good opportunity to be able to learn from our counterparts and to be able then to implement what they are doing in their prevention initiatives as part of our prevention campaign. So it's a system of continuous improvement and continual learning. And the more that we are exposed to, the more that we inculcate into our initiatives, and the more we then grow.
I think, some of what is interesting about the SIU, and I think I'm going back to the way you structured and the way the SIU runs as an institution, is that with the demands you're making of the institutions you investigate and the changes you want to see in those institutions, you seem to model some of those things internally. So could you just map out how the SIU attempts to build that culture internally?
The first thing is that everyone is vetted prior to joining the SIU. So there's a rigorous screening process that applicants would have to go through before joining the SIU. Once you are part of the SIU, you are then vetted on an annual basis. And then we also recognize that because we are the guardians of the public interest and the protectors of the public purse, we have to lead by example. We have an internal integrity unit that is responsible for conducting random screenings, ad hoc screenings, layered voice stress analysis is used as well. And the most recent development is that all SIU employees will now be subjected to lifestyle audits.
Right.
And we believe that by having these systems in place, we can then ensure that the SIU only then employs what the SIU Act refers to as fit and proper persons. Because ultimately, if we are going to be the watchdogs, or if we are the watchdogs, and we are the guardians of the public purse and the public interest, then we have to put our best foot forward.
That seems to sort of replicate itself, though, in terms of internal cultural practices. You see, we come across people at the SIU who love their jobs. And that doesn't seem to be only about the integrities, but it's something about the internal processes and systems. It's about job satisfaction. What are those elements, do you think?
They are when we did an exercise about 2 or 3 years ago, we wanted to determine what is the average age of the SIU, and I think at that stage it was between 30 and 35 years old, and we were then told we are an aging organization. In fact, I think that a large number of the SIU staff have been there in excess of 15 years. So it talks about, people coming to the SIU, joining the SIU and not wanting to leave. We've become almost like people refer to us sometimes as lifers. You come in and you never leave. But the reason for that is not that people become comfortable in their jobs. I think that personally, the reason why people choose to stay for so long is because in your own way, you are making a difference. It's not just a cliche of, I'm doing a job and I'm helping someone. You can actually see tangibly when the SIU reports on its performance on an annual basis. You can see how much money has been recovered, what losses have been prevented, how many disciplinary referrals there have been, how many criminal prosecutions there have been. And each and every member of the SIU has, in his or her own way, contributed to that. So you are making a difference. You're making a difference to your country. You're making a difference to future generations. And the way I like to see it is that when you join the SIU, it's not just a job. It's actually a calling. You're answering a call. And many people have heeded that call. And in your own way, you can one day be able to stand up and say, I was there. I was part of the solution. I've made a difference.
And sustaining that into the future, protecting the SIU for the next 10 to 20 years where we need it to function. What would you say are the 3 to 5 priorities for us to address as we go forward?
As I've mentioned already, the Act needs to be overhauled in its entirety, not just piecemeal amendments. When the Act is reviewed, prevention should be included as a specific function of the SIU. The funding model needs to be changed. The SIU's recommendations for remedial action should be legally binding. That will then give us powers to be able to enforce or to compel. And then the SIU should have the mandate to be able to do real-time investigations when an allegation is reported to the SIU and not have to wait and go through a proclamation process. Alternatively, the SIU should be able to, of its own volition, be able to initiate an investigation. If there is a matter of significant public interest, the SIU should be able to then initiate an investigation into those matters. I think that would, to a very large extent, enhance our effectiveness. It will also then answer questions. The other one would be an optimal institutional form, because currently the way the SIU is structured is that the SIU depends on the president for a proclamation. When he concludes an investigation, it must report back to the president. Now, we've never had political interference in the way we've done our work. But, I think it was Paul Hoffman who said in his book, he says, independence is like pregnancy. You can't be half pregnant. You either are or you're not. And it's the same with the SIU. We need to be truly independent, de facto, de jure independent. And I think that will then dispel any notions about us being able to be politically influenced by anyone. The Zondo Commission spoke about having about whistleblowing and having a centralized port of call for whistleblowers. One of the things that I wanted to mention is that I'm responsible for case registration and assessment. What that entails is we have a central electronic system where all whistleblower reports are logged. So we are able to then track and monitor the process of those complaints from the time it's reported up until the time that there's an outcome of that report. And I think that it speaks to the fact that whistleblowers have confidence approaching the SIU. Over the last 3 or 4 years, we've averaged 1,500 reports per financial year. And it's only because we're able to receive a report, register it, assign a reference number, and then provide feedback to a whistleblower on what has happened with that report, which not many other state institutions are actually doing. And I think for us that's important. The second thing is that we are working with the presidency and CETA to develop a central case monitoring mechanism.
Yeah, speak to that.
That's going to be a game changer, because what the system will allow is that all SIU recommendations for remedial action will now be able to be tracked from a central point. It's going to be able to ensure accountability and consequence management. And importantly, we will then be able to see at a point when the SIU makes a recommendation for remedial action and it goes to, for example, the National Prosecuting Authority, we would be able to track where it is in the life cycle. If anyone has dropped the ball, who has dropped the ball, why isn't it moving along? And we can then assist in ensuring that every referral reaches its logical conclusion, which is not what we've had in the past. And I think it's going to be a very, very important system, not just for the SIU, but for government as a whole, because if this system is successful, it's going to then include recommendations coming out of the Zondo Commission or any future commissions of inquiry will all feed into the same system.
So the President's National Anti-Corruption Advisory Commission has made recommendations that the new Office for Public Integrity, which it envisages to support the prevention agenda and drive it forward, engages the SIU and continues with the models you've developed in terms of prevention. How do you see that playing out, assuming that the presidency accepts those recommendations?
I think that we as the SIU are in a very, very fortunate position in that even before NACAC had made its recommendations, we had already started doing the work that NACAC has envisaged. So we've positioned ourselves very, very well. And if tomorrow we were to be told that we must now transition into the OPI, it would be a relatively seamless transition, because our infrastructure for prevention and for data analytics it's already there. It's just a question of moving in and then enhancing our capabilities. So, due to I think the foresight of Advocate Mutibi, we positioned ourselves very well. We anticipated what was coming, and we are ready. If we are told that we must move into OPI, we are ready, because we will be able to hit the ground running. It wouldn't be something that would be new to us.
Yeah. So I'm just wondering, what's the transition that you think would be the easiest one that gets us there? Not Chapter 9, obviously, yet. But how do we get your prevention agenda functional and all the stuff you've built around prevention functional within a structure that has more power to do it? Is it a quick fix with the SIU Act? The way they did PRECA, the PRECA amendment came out of the blue.
And it speaks to political will, essentially. That's what you need to champion this. So for me, the quick fix would be, we already have a set of amendments that are with the Department of Justice. Those amendments speak to essentially what OPI is envisaged to do. If there's political will to then drive those amendments through to finality, it could happen. As you say, Section 34A was done relatively overnight. It happened very quickly. If the SIU amendments are then pushed through on the same basis, we will be able to operate as the OPI, because we've considered the OPI mandate, and we've included that as part of the amendments that we are now seeking.
Okay, it's exciting to know. Okay, Pranesh, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation.
Only a pleasure, Cheryl. Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks.
Thank you.